block editor, how they work, what's next, by Isabel, who is a software developer at Automatic and has been a maintainer and full-time contributor to WordPress core for the past 5 years. And if she's not writing, reviewing, or otherwise wrangling code, she'll be out in the sun, growing herbs and veggies, and working on art projects. Sounds like a balanced lifestyle. So if we can give her a hand.
Thank you. Yes, I'm also very into cats, so if you want to ask me questions about that, I'm also happy to receive them. So I'm here to talk about layouts, and the main reason that I'm here to talk about layouts is that I am one of the core developers who have been working on layouts on and off for the past couple of years. So I thought I'd give a talk about the thing that I probably know best about in all of WordPress. Now, you could ask, what even is a layout? There's this block editor thing, and it does tons of stuff. You can use it to edit posts, and you can use it to build whole websites, apparently. And layouts are part of that more website building functionality, so the more page buildery side of Gutenberg, if you like. So layout it's a feature. It's what we call part of the block supports API, and the block supports are kind of, as the name indicates, we're not really good at naming things. It's like, these are features that you can add to blocks so that blocks will support that feature and will be able to do stuff. And so there's all sorts of design-related features as part of this API. You have like color, typography, you have, what else? Oh, there's a ton of them. There's actually, there's some docs if I'm not very organized with the, so yeah. So there's a whole, in the developer docs, there's this whole page called supports, and that will give you all the information on what supports exist and how they work. So you can go there if you want to know more about all the different kinds of supports that exist for blocks and what they do. They mainly do sort of styling-related stuff, though. Let me go back to my slideshow now. So layout in particular. So a lot of the other block supports, like color, for instance, you can add it to, well, pretty much any block that, and it'll work on the block itself. So if you have a text block, you add color to it, you'll then be able to change the color of the text, or you might be able to change the color of the background or something like that. But layout is a little bit unique in that it's a feature that only works for container blocks. So it has to be a block that will accept inner blocks, and it only really works if you structure your inner blocks in a certain way. I'll go a bit more on that later. But first, the pressing question might be, how do I add this layout thing to a block? Now, when you create a block, so say you're creating custom blocks, you have to have a block.json file with all the info on what the block is and its name and all that stuff. And inside the block.json, there is a section called supports. And it's inside that support section that you put the things that you want your block to support. And if you want it to support layout, then you add a little layout object, and you can set the default type of layout that you want for that block. So there are several different types of layout that you can set. In this case, in this example, we're setting a layout as a flex layout. That'll allow you to do a bunch of different stuff that I'm going to show in a second. Yes, right now. I'm going to show it right now. So I've got a bit of demo. There are 4 different layout types, and I am going to show them first, because if I just tell you about them, I don't know. I think it works better if you actually see what's happening. So let me see what we have here. I've got a bunch of, yeah. Okay. So this is a post, and this post has a custom template, and I think we better start with actually looking at the template. So if you're in the post sidebar in here, you have this option called Edit Template, which is what we're going to go into. Then if you click that, assuming this is sort of a full block theme, this theme is 2025. So it's the very, very latest. coming out actually in WordPress 6.7, which is due to be released in a couple of weeks. So it's not actually sort of a thing yet, but it's just about to become a thing. Yeah, so what we have in here is a template editor, and when you open it, you can see everything that your template is composed of. So here, looking at the list view, which I find really useful, you see that you have three blocks in here. There's a group that comprises the header, there's a separator, which basically creates a little line, and then you have another group. And groups are just general purpose containers. Groups can have anything in them. And mainly, the main reason that you'd use a group would be to give the contents of the group some form of layout. So group is sort of the most, I guess, the most layout-y block of all the core blocks in existence. And in this case, this group isn't really doing a whole lot. This group is just acting as a container for another group which contains the title and then a content block. But you'll notice that the parent group, if you look at there's this layout section here in the sidebar, this is the outer group that's wrapping the content section, and the layout over there has a little toggle that says inner blocks use content width, and that toggle is off. When that toggle is off, that means that the layout type we're using is the default layout. The default layout is like the most sort of plain and unadorned layout type that you can possibly get. It doesn't really do much. The only thing that it does is set a block spacing between the blocks that are inside it. So in this case, we have 2 blocks inside this block. We have that group, and if you see, I've got the content block selected, and if I sort of hover over the group that contains the title, you see there's a little bit of space. When you see the outlines, there's a little bit of space between those 2 outlines, and that's the spacing between those 2 blocks. This is the only thing that default layout type does. Now, if you look at this group that has the title inside it, now the only reason this group is here is to wrap around that title block. And what it's doing, you'll notice that this, in the case of this group, in the layout, that inner blocks use content width toggle. Is anybody having trouble reading this? I could zoom in a bit if you think that this is too small. Do you reckon I should zoom in a bit? Yeah, because I'm struggling a bit. Sorry. I want really big letters on everything. Okay, cool. I think this might be a bit more legible. So in this case, let's make sure that we actually still see this whole layout section. In this case, that toggle is on, and you see we have some extra fields here. So setting on that toggle will make a content width and a wide width field appear, and it'll also make a justification field appear. Now, what do these things do? Well, this is now a different form of layout. It's no longer the default layout. It's what we call the constrained layout. And what this layout type does, so default adds block spacing between the blocks. Constrained layout also adds that spacing. So in that respect, it behaves identically. The one additional thing it adds is content width. So it, as the name indicates, it constrains the contents of the parent block. In this case, what we can see here, and now we can't really see it so well because we zoomed in a lot, but you see the title block isn't really pushing up against that left-hand side. There's a bit of a space on either side, and that is because the group block is defining a maximum width for all its contents. Okay, but then we have the content block, which is also inside that parent, and content block also has layout. And the content block, even though you don't see content sort of doesn't contain any extra blocks when you see it in the template view, the content is actually what's going to be the content of your post or your page. And so content always contains blocks. I mean, you know, it'll definitely contain blocks inside it as long as your post contains blocks inside it. So it is a container block, and it also has layout. And in this case, its layout is also set to be constrained, but you'll notice that in this case, we're adding some values into content and wide width fields. So when you leave those fields empty, what happens is we're going to go and look at the theme's theme.json file, and in that file, the theme will set its default content width and its default wide width. So that's what we're going to pick up and use. So that's, for instance, that's what's being used in the title block, which there appears to be a block toolbar hiding at the moment. So you see that what's in this content block, that just sort of boilerplate content, has a narrower width than the title block. The title's using the default theme content width, whereas for this content block, we added a custom content width. And we added a custom wide width so that if we have anything set in the post that's going to use this template, if we have anything set to align wide, it'll take up that wide width. Now, what does the justification do, you might ask? It justifies the content to one side or to the other. It doesn't justify like, you know, coming from sort of text editor world where you sort of make it like all aligned to the right or make it all aligned to the left. That's not, it just takes the block of content and it pushes it to the left or to the right-hand side, or it centers it. And it does that by adding, so when you have this constrained content width, you have a max width set on all the children. If the content is justified left or right, it'll just add a margin auto to whatever side is relevant. So if you, in this case, if you have a left margin set to auto, then it's just going to push everything to the right. So that's what's happening under the hood. Cool. Now, if we go back out of the template and into the post, we'll see that, oh yeah, I set this. I haven't actually saved that option, but my unsaved template editing, where I justified all the content to the right, has been kept in this view. So theoretically, I could go edit a template and I could like actually not save the changes. I think if I click the save here, yep. So if I click save here, because I made an edit to the template, it's actually going to ask me, was that what you wanted to do? Do you want to keep this change? Because that change, because it's made on the template level, it's going to affect everything that's using that template. So it might not just be this post, there might be other posts using the same template. So you want to check that that's what the user actually wants to do. Anyway, we have here a post with a custom template, and there you can see that the text content of this post has kind of narrower content widths than usual. This image is set to wide width, so it's whatever custom wide widths I set. I think it was like 750 pixels or something. And then under this, and again, we can't get rid of the list view and see if, yeah, so you could see the difference. Under this, I added a group block that I set to align full, so it's occupying the full width of the window. And group blocks, when you just add a group block somewhere, by default, it'll use a constrained layout. So I haven't changed any settings on this group block. It has this constrained layout, and because there's nothing in the content and wide width, it's just going to use the theme content and wide width. So and this is sort of an important detail, which is if you have, so you're inside a content block, inside a template that has its custom width, but if you add a group block in there, it's not going to inherit the custom width of its parent block. It's just going to take whatever the theme's default settings are. So you can't sort of make a custom width be inherited by nested group blocks. Cool, and that's pretty much, yeah. So just so we're very clear on what the default layout is. So this group block has its constrained layout. So we have some content width, we have wide width, and then I duplicated this block underneath just to show what this would look like if you set it to the default layout. So if we select this group, you'll see that's the default layout. The only thing it has is like block spacing between the blocks. And so you'll notice that all the content of this block just takes up the full width of the window. That's basically plain unstyled HTML, really, apart from the block spacing. Like, you can't get any more basic than that. Cool. So, should I go back to the slides? Order. So I've got a little. I could share the slides afterwards. So default uses containers, default display type. This is important because for most blocks, the display type, for most groups would use div HTML elements or, say, main or something like that, and those elements usually have a display type of block. That's the most sort of common display type for these container elements. But potentially, the default display type could be something else. So we don't actually set a display type with this layout, so it'll take whatever the containers, whatever is native to that HTML element that the container is using. So just something to pay attention to in case you add layout to, say, an anchor tag or something that has a default of inline display. Things could not work exactly as expected. Yeah, and then we have the constraint layout. And next, I am going to show which one. I have a bunch of posts open, and now I don't really know which is which. That's a grid. Wait, I don't think I have experimental grid. That's for later. Here's a post with cats and a grid. I'm just going to go and look for my. I'm not going to save those changes. Yes, so the next layout I'm going to show is Flex. Flex is probably the best example of a block that uses Flex is the row, which is a variation of the group block. But you also have, in core blocks, you have like buttons, you have social icons, columns uses a sort of very reduced version of the Flex layout that you can't really edit. Same for gallery. The gallery block uses Flex layout in a very, very custom way if you go look at the code. It's really interesting, but you can't really do much with it. But row is an example of a block that you can, and navigation also uses a Flex layout. So Flex sets the display type of the container to Flex, and that means that by default, the items just sort of go in a row, and then you have a bunch of controls over there that allow you to set justification. You can move it around, you can add space between, or you can change the orientation, in which case it now, if it's a row block, which is a variation of group, it will become another variation of group, which is called the stack. And this is just, it's the same block. We just changed, it's still a Flex layout, we just changed it from vertical to horizontal, from horizontal to vertical orientation, sorry. You can still justify it. Space between doesn't, no, actually, this should be stretch, yeah. So if you have a vertical layout, you can actually make the justification be like stretch, which you kind of see in this heading that has a background color. If I centered it, for instance, then that block will just take up the space of the text it has, whereas if I set it to stretch, it just goes like full width. Cool, so this is the Flex layout. That's a, yeah, that was a row. I converted it to stack. I had another example of a stack down here. That's pretty much, I mean, and if you're familiar with Flexbox, then it's kind of, it's very close to how the Flex spec works. The only thing that we do that's sort of not default CSS Flexbox is, by default, when you set a container when you set Flex layout type on the container, we add a bit of alignment. We align the items, we center align the items, whereas I think the default in the Flex spec is to align them top, but I'm not 100% sure of this. I know what we're doing is not the default behavior. There's another thing which I think I have on the slide. Yes, and the other thing that we do, yeah. So by default, within the Flexbox spec, the items won't wrap. What we do is, with Flex layout, we set the items to wrap. and we set center align. So it's not like vanilla Flexbox. It's got a little bit of customization in it. At the time, this was thought to be the best approach because it gave the best experience. And now it's too late to change it because a lot of websites are using it. So there you go, we're stuck with it. And the other thing we do that's actually, I think, is quite useful is setting, if there are any children that have margins, you set those margins to 0, because once you have blocks inside a Flexbox and you're aligning and justifying them, you kind of expect them to sort of align in a certain way. And if the blocks have margins, that might be ruined. So we just blanket set the margins to 0 on all the children. And the other example of layout, which I guess is my favorite because it's the one I got to work on more, is the grid layout. Now this post actually has 2 grids. I should have done something. Hang on, I'm just going to add another second grid. Okay, so this is the first grid. Now I put 2 grids here. They're essentially the same bunch of cat pictures in this grid, but this is just to exemplify the 2 types of grids that we can have currently. So grid number 1, you'll notice in these layout controls here, it's set to auto, and it has a minimum column width setting of 12 rem. And what that does is it creates a grid where the columns have that column width as a minimum, but they will fill, so the grid will fill with the number of columns that's needed to occupy the whole window and all of those columns. So if the window has a width of a perfect multiple of 12 plus the spacing in between, then those columns will be exactly 12 rem. If not, they'll be a little more. They'll always sort of expand a little to fill the container. And once you have space for another column, they'll expand, expand, expand. Once they think, I can fit another column in here, then they'll just fit another column. So that's the default sort of out of box. If you set something to use a grid layout, that's the default experience. And then the other one, what we call manual mode, is where you just set the number of columns. And so here you have a grid. You tell it to do 3 columns, and it'll always have 3 columns independently of the width of the page. So if I want to like go, we could actually look at this in the front end. That must be the post-featured image that's appearing up here. Yeah. Anyway, so hang on, I'm just going to save that so we get the little, yeah, the thing that separates one grid from. So the first grid, you see, it's going to take up as many columns as fit on the page, and it's sort of going to reorganize its contents depending on how many columns fit on the page. Whereas the second grid, it's got 3 columns. And that bigger picture happens to be occupying 2 of those columns, which I'll get to in a minute. But the thing is, you can make it as small as you like, and that second grid is always going to have the same number of columns. So it's not it's responsive in the way because the columns shrink, but like the layout doesn't reflow, unlike the first example. Cool. Now, let me see. Let's go back to my slides. Yep. So the grid, basically what it does is it sets the container display type to grid, and it also sets margin 0 on the children, because if you have grid items with margins in them, then they might not align to the grid and it'll look messy. Although, I mean, in theory, yeah, so this is an interesting one. You could theoretically do interesting things if you set negative margins on grid children. You could create overlaps and stuff like that. And we do kind of have support for negative margins already in core, but yeah, these things don't always interact well with each other, so it's complicated. I think we'll get there. So one of the things that I'm going to get to in a bit is the parts of grid that are still experiments and haven't been stabilized yet, and there are some related things that I can show you there. But up next, what settings? So how can we configure this layout thing? There's a bunch of settings. There's also, I had a docs page. There is a docs page somewhere. No, that's not it. I think possibly in the block supports layout. You can see the settings. And I scrolled past the point, and I can't reload the page because I'm not connected to the network. Anyway, you can check out the docs in your own time. What we have for settings is a bunch of different stuff. So allow switching is a setting that you can add to layout that will actually make a little toggle control appear in your layout sidebar section, and it'll allow you to switch between different types of layouts. So it's kind of like, basically, what we have here in the group layout is that top thing where you can, those different icons. The first is like default or constrained layout, then you have row, stack, and grid, and you can switch between the different layout types. So that allow switching would enable a similar-ish toggle, but uglier than that one, because it was added right at the beginning and then it was never really used. So technically, if you're building a custom block, you can use it, but it might not look very nice. We'll get around to it someday. We'll get around to improving it. There are lots of plans for layout. Allow editing. This is a really important one. Allow editing is probably what you want to bear in mind if you want to like lock down functionality. So say you're building a theme and you don't want your users to be able to edit any types of layouts anywhere. You don't want them to mess up your designs. So you can actually just blanket switch layout controls off from your theme.json. If you go, so theme.json has like a settings section and a styles section. In the settings section, you can add a little layout subsection, and then in that layout subsection, you will add allow editing and set it to false. And then no layout controls will appear anywhere. So that's a good solution if you don't want anyone to change your stuff. And also you can use it at a block level. So in your theme.json, if you want to just disable layout controls for a certain type of block, like just for buttons blocks or just for whatever other block uses layout, post template or something, you can also do that. Just disable the controls for that type of block. So this is a really important one to keep in mind. Allowing inheriting is kind of a legacy setting. I put it there because it's technically part of the API, but it's it always defaults to true, basically. Like, I guess you could set it to false if you wanted to have a block with a sort of default layout type, and you wouldn't want it ever to be switchable to a constrained layout type, which by default, default and constrained, you can kind of switch between them. But you could also allow, you could also use allow editing to disable that. So it's kind of redundant right now. Allow sizing on children is also a very interesting one, and I'm going to show you more about that, what that one does. It defaults to false, but if you enable it, you can use it on the flex and the grid layout types to be able to resize the child blocks of that container block. And then allow vertical alignment, allow justification, allow orientation, and allow custom content and wide size are all settings that allow you to disable specific controls. So I can show you, so vertical alignment, for instance, that would disable that toolbar control that allows you to align in, for instance, in a flex display, to align items to the bottom or to the top or to stretch them, whatever. And allow justification will work for both flex type layouts to disable justification or for the non-flex type layouts that I no longer have here. So in the let me see how I can get back to post. Not that here. The group block, when you have it set to a constrained layout, there are these justification controls here. You can also disable them with that justification. Allow justification control, allow orientation, well, same, but it'll disable the orientation. So you can, like, so you have a horizontal flex blocks and you don't want it ever to be made vertical. And custom content and wide size is for those custom content and wide width controls in the constrained layout. So basically, we created off switches for everything because, like, the first thing that happens when you create, I'm not joking here, I wish I was joking, but I'm not. When you create, like, a new feature, is people are going to go, how can I turn it off? I hate it. Please make it go away. And so you kind of have to do that. You kind of have to give people off switches because, you know, I think WordPress is all about flexibility. So it does make sense that you get new features, but you should always be allowed to opt out of them. And more importantly, if you're a person who builds websites for other people, you should be allowed to lock down certain behaviors and not let, because people might not be very technical and they might just go like, press all the buttons and they don't really know what they're doing and then they mess things up and then they go, oh, I messed it up, how do I fix this, please? And so it's really often better to just not let them mess things up in the first place. So yeah, switch everything off. Now, allow sizing on children. I said I'd get back to that. I just want to do quick. How am I for time? I really haven't been timing myself. Am I good? I have 10 minutes? Okay. Quickly show this and quickly show you the experimental stuff. So allow sizing on children is disabled by default, I said. It's enabled for group blocks in core. Within the core blocks, there are very few blocks where it's enabled. It's group and its variations. And I think for navigation block, we also allow sizing on children. What it does basically for flex blocks is, so this is a row, right? And I've selected this heading block that's within this row. And down here, you see in the dimensions, and this is a bit sort of counterintuitive because these sort of child layout controls don't appear within the layout section. Currently, they appear in dimensions. This is also something that there's been a fair bit of discussion around. I think most people think it would be better to have them under a layout section because really they're layout controls. But anyway, that's another thing. We'll get to it at some point. And we have a few options. So if fit is the default, it just takes up whatever space is natural to it. But if you set it to grow, it'll stretch to fill whatever empty space you have in the container. And if you set it to fixed, you could make it, I don't know, you can make it really narrow if you wanted, or you could make it... So here's the thing, fixed isn't quite fixed. It's mostly fixed, because if you want to set this to 3,000 pixels, no, I don't want to leave the page, it will not set it to actual 3,000 pixels unless there are 3,000 pixels within the window that it can occupy. So it's fixed, but it shrinks, which is default Flexbox behavior. Flex children usually will shrink to fit whatever container they're inside, unless you deliberately set them to not shrink. We have not deliberately set these to not shrink, so they will shrink. I think it would have been a lot of fun if the fixed width was really fixed and you could then do stuff like horizontal scrolling, but that, on the other hand, that might be a terrible experience for people who are not expecting horizontal scroll to appear. So, you know, it's kind of a fine balance between doing neat stuff and doing stuff in a way that's not super confusing for people who are not advanced CSS users. So that's child controls in Flex. In Grid, it's actually even cooler because we now have a draggy-droppy thing where you can actually change the size. So basically in a grid block, what you do is you change the number of rows and columns that a block occupies. So I wanted to make it big. Yeah, so you could make blocks really big, occupying, say, however many columns and rows of the grid you like. And that's basically it. So if you go into the child block styles, what you'll see in the form of controls is, again, in the dimensions panel, you'll see column span and row span. So if you don't want to drag and drop, I mean, if you're stuck with using a keyboard, then you probably don't want to drag and drop. You probably want to use a control, and that's what you can find in the sidebar. And you can change the number of columns and rows, and it'll work. It'll do what you want it to do. Cool. So those are the child controls. That's what that allow sizing on children does. Now, disclaimers. What are our disclaimers? Okay, yes. So a couple of those layout types that I just showed only work with block or hybrid themes, and those are the default and particularly the constrained layout, because they depend on the theme defining a content size and a wide size, and that only happens if the theme has a theme.json file. So basically, when I say, well, block themes are themes that always have theme.json files. In this case, what I mean by hybrid themes could be a classic theme. You know, you have your PHP templates, and you even have a style sheet and stuff, but you might throw a theme.json file in there, and that will enable a bit of extra functionality. And one of the things it enables is if you set a content width for your theme, then you'll get the constrained layout type. The flex and the grid always work even on classic themes because they're too useful sometimes to even put in the content, so it was decided that they should work for every type of theme. Anyway, there's not a problem with, you know, there's no sort of, okay, occasionally themes might have stuff in their style sheet that might interfere with the styling that we provide for the layout, but usually they work really fine with classic themes. Now, the one technicality about layout, I said that you can only use it on blocks that are containers and that have inner blocks. The fact is that you can only actually use it if your container block is setting their inner blocks in a certain way using the use inner blocks props hook. So if you've built blocks before, you know, you usually have this edit function and you that shows you where you define what happens in the editor with the block. And you have you can have a container, and then you can define the space where you put your inner blocks as a component, say an inner blocks component, or you can use this hook, which is use inner blocks props. And layout will only work if you use the hook, not if you use the inner blocks component. So that's just something to bear in mind. So that's an example of what it should look like, your edit function. You'd have the section, in this case, is the container, and then you have the inner blocks props defining where the inner blocks go. Cool. What's next? New grid features. Okay, I have to zoom past this because, all those other things don't matter. I really just want to show you the grid features that are experimental. So if you're using the Gutenberg plugin, you enable it, you get that little Gutenberg menu down at the bottom, and if you click into this experiments page, you can enable a bunch of experimental, unstable stuff that's being worked on, and there's no guarantees that it won't break your website, and that's why it's behind this experiments page. It's do not enable this in production, just play with it a bit in your own time. Anyway, one of these experiments is grid interactivity, and what you can currently get, is this the right post? No, okay. What you can currently get is a bit of a change in the different grid types we define. So we have auto and manual, right? That's in core. Auto and manual, as I showed you before, are already in core. Now, what we have as an experiment is we made a few changes, and in the auto version, you now get to define, optionally, you can define both the number of columns and the minimum column width. And that will mean that, if you go view the post, if I'm defining both, it both takes up the number of columns that, well, it both uses the number of columns that you specify, so it'll never get more than 3 columns, but also it will be responsive. It'll reflow in a way that, those 3 columns will never go under that minimum column width that you specify. And so you can simultaneously give it a max column number, and you can also make it reflow. So that would be pretty neat. And what did we do with manual mode? Because manual mode before was you set the number of columns, but manual mode is something completely different now. It's basically a mode where you can just set a specific position for your blocks. So I can drag a block over here, and all the other bits of the grid are empty, and it can just sit over there, which by default in auto mode that never happens, because the grid just sort of fills up its spots in first available order. If you drop a new block in there, it'll just go into the first empty spot. But with this new manual mode, you can have grids with lots of empty bits in between. So you'd have just empty block over there. And this, I'm not a designer, so this looks as it looks, but I'm sure designers can do some really neat stuff with this. And the other cool thing is that you can overlap blocks, so I could just put a block on top of another, and if that block is like a bit bigger, then I can make it sort of partially overlap, which is also cool. So that's the thing that would behave kind of like, it would do kind of the stuff that you'd also be able to do if you had negative margins inside grid children. Yeah, so that's the thing I'm really excited about. That's the thing that I want to work on next. I want to get this stuff out. Initially, I was hoping it would be ready for 6.7, but unfortunately not. So we'll have to wait a bit. So how can you help? If you would like to contribute to this project, then this is the Gutenberg repo. Pop in. If you have complaints, look, just let me know. I know that layout isn't perfect. There's a lot of stuff that can be improved here, right? But I'll never know what's wrong unless people give me feedback. And like all my colleagues working on it, we all welcome feedback a lot. So like, come and tell us what's broken. Like, I can't use this. This experience is terrible. Or here is this suggestion for improvement. I have this use case. This thing would be really useful to me. All of that is like very, very, very welcome. So if nothing else, if you're using a feature, if you find something that could be improved, please, please let us know. If you are a dev and you would like to contribute to the code, you are also very welcome to do so. We have a ton of open issues. If you want to specifically contribute to layout, there's a feature layout label in the repo. So we use that to label any layout-related issues. You can go and have a look at the bugs. You can go look at we have lots of plans for improvements in the future. You can go look at those and tell us that those are terrible ideas or that you love that and you'd like to see this or that or that. So yeah, please come and like give us a hand and tell us stuff. And that's Charlie. This is my cat, which is the most important part of the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. I naturally think in terms of CSS, so it's really funny to see the options about just toggling things, and really nice to see the dependence on CSS Grid for layouts now that it's safe enough to use, right? And all the overlapping and the magical stuff, it's natural, like it's, yeah. We have lunch now, so if you have any questions, I don't know if I should recommend that you chase Isabel down at lunchtime, but we've run out of time now.
It's fine. Like
there you go, it's fine. You can chase her down.
Chase me down over lunch and ask me all the questions. I'm sorry I didn't leave time for questions. I wasn't really super organized with the timing for this prezo. That happens sometimes when I'm excited about what I'm talking about. But